The air inside the sterile ICU was a symphony of rhythmic terror, dominated by the shrill, persistent screaming of a dozen billion-dollar monitors that had all turned a blinding, frantic red. At the center of the glass-walled room, young Chloe Sterling was trapped in the grip of a violent, unrelenting seizure, her body arching against the high-tech sensors that were supposed to be her salvation. Alistair Sterling, the billionaire mogul, stood at the foot of the bed, his face a mottled mask of fury and helplessness as he bellowed at the country's most decorated doctors. They stood in their pristine white lab coats, paralyzed by the data on their tablets, unable to explain why their AI-driven protocols were failing to stop the girl's descent. Suddenly, the heavy, pressurized door slid open, and Thomas Reed stepped quietly into the room. He didn't wear a coat or a badge. He wore a faded flannel.
He reached out with calloused hands and performed a manual vagus nerve lock, a maneuver from 1950 that modern medicine had discarded as a relic. These machines were designed to save her, but they were actually the thing killing her. Only Thomas Reed knew why. 3 days before the machines in the city began to fail, the stillness of the Appalachian foothills was broken by the discordant hiss of an overheating engine. A sleek, obsidian-black SUV, a vehicle that cost more than most of the homes in the county, lurched to a jagged halt in front of Reed's apothecary and clinic. Alistair Sterling stepped out of the climate-controlled cabin, his polished leather shoes crunching into the red dirt with a visible air of disgust. He looked up at the weathered wooden sign that featured a hand-painted mortar and pestle, his eyes narrowing as they swept over the rows of glass jars filled with dried roots and dark fermented tinctures visible through the window. Thomas Reed was on the porch, his sleeves rolled up as he rhythmically ground a handful of dried elderberry. Alistair didn't ask for directions or water. He demanded immediate assistance, with a voice that was used to commanding boardrooms.
He gestured toward the apothecary jars with a sneer of pure, unfiltered contempt, laughing as he asked if Thomas was a legitimate medical practitioner or merely a witch doctor selling hope to the gullible and the poor. He mocked the smell of sage and cedar, calling Thomas a pathetic failure of the modern age who was clinging to the superstitions of the past. Alistair paced the dusty porch, his voice rising as he told Thomas that men like him were the reason the world had stayed in the Dark Ages for so long, clinging to the dirt instead of the digital light of biotech innovation. He barked that his own firm was currently perfecting the end of human suffering, while Thomas was stuck playing in the mud with weeds and jars. Thomas simply continued his rhythmic grinding, his eyes remaining as flat and unyielding as the mountains behind him. He didn't defend his jars or his cabin. Alistair saw a man grinding roots, completely blind to the reality of the man standing before him. He didn't see the man who once held the record for the most successful neurosurgeries in history. His deep arrogance.
Thomas pushed through the screen door, the billionaire's hollow insults still vibrating in the stagnant afternoon heat outside. He entered the quiet, cedar-scented cool of the house, where the air was always sweet with the lingering aroma of lavender and the peppermint tea Maya insisted on for every meal. His 6-year-old daughter was sitting on the rug in the center of the living room, her small brow furrowed in concentration as she carefully bandaged the wing of a plush toy owl named Doc. The owl wore a tiny, functional stethoscope that Thomas had handcrafted from aircraft-grade aluminum and surgical tubing, a miniature masterpiece of precision that he had built in the quiet hours of the middle night. Thomas watched her for a moment, the memory of her mother hitting him with a sharp, jagged ache that never truly disappeared from his tired heart. Sarah had been a brilliant research scientist, a woman who believed that the future of medicine was a sacred trust, until she became the first hidden casualty of a high-priced drug Alistair's company had rushed to market without adequate safety testing.
That was the day Thomas had walked away from the high-stakes world of Johns Hopkins and the sterile hallways of power, burying his brilliance in the red dirt of the foothills to ensure that Maya never had to grow up in a world where profits were valued more than the pulse of a human life. He knelt beside her, his large, calloused thumb tracing the edge of the tiny silver bell on the owl's stethoscope. That toy was Maya's anchor, a physical connection to a father who had sacrificed everything to become her constant, and a mother she only knew through the stories he told her before bed. Maya looked up with Sarah's bright, analytical eyes and asked if he had helped the mean man with the big black car. Thomas simply smiled, his voice soft as he told her that some people were so busy looking at the sun they forgot how to see the path beneath their own feet. He knew that deep in a hidden, fireproof cabinet in his basement lay a research file on a specific drug that Alistair Sterling thought had been destroyed years ago. He was ready for the hard and long cold morning light. He knew the truth. Everything mattered. He remained still.
As the obsidian SUV lurched away, kicking up a plume of red dust that hung in the air like a warning, Thomas didn't look at the receding taillights or the expensive logo on the rear gate. Instead, his gaze was fixed on the second-row window, where the billionaire's young daughter, Chloe, had been staring out at the trees with a glazed, disconnected expression. In the 5 seconds the vehicle had been stationary, Thomas's eyes had performed a diagnostic scan that no million-dollar imaging suite could replicate. He had seen a tiny, irregular purpuric rash, a specific bruise-like discoloration peeking out from behind her left earlobe, and he had noticed the microscopic, rhythmic tremor in her right hand as she clutched a gold-plated tablet. It was a combination of symptoms he knew with a terrifying, intimate certainty. He realized in a cold flash of professional clarity that the girl wasn't just sick, she was suffering from Sterling syndrome, the very rare hyperinflammatory condition that Alistair Sterling was currently claiming to have cured with his new flagship AI drug. But the rash and the tremor told a different, darker story.
These weren't the signs of a disease in retreat. They were the unmistakable hallmarks of metallurgical toxicity. The girl was showing signs that the very medicine Alistair was selling to the world was currently saturating her system and beginning to cross the blood-brain barrier. Alistair was toasting to his corporate victory in the city, entirely oblivious to the fact that his own daughter was becoming the first hidden victim of the very lie he was peddling. Thomas stood on the porch, the mortar and pestle still in his hand, knowing that the billionaire's pride was about to collide with a biological reality that no amount of wealth could buy its way out of. He knew the clock had already started ticking toward a catastrophic seizure that would baffle the experts. The billionaire's great pride. Everything was wrong. He stood still.
The morning light was cold and unforgiving as it crawled across the mountain of past-due bills sitting on Thomas's scarred wooden desk. It was a bitter, jagged irony that a man who had spent his life repairing the shattered neural pathways of others was now struggling to cover the basic health insurance premiums for his own child. Maya's monthly pediatric checkup was due, and the small jar on the mantel was stubbornly stagnant despite his long hours at the clinic. Thomas walked to the town's only pharmacy, a sleek, sterile franchised outlet that had replaced the old family-run apothecary 2 years ago. The lead pharmacist, a man named Miller, who wore a Sterling Tech corporate lanyard with a sycophantic pride, looked at Thomas's request for basic isopropyl alcohol and specialized surgical gauze with a cold corporate indifference. When Thomas asked to put the supplies on credit until the end of the month, Miller pushed the items back behind the thick safety glass with a condescending smirk.
He told Thomas that homegrown practitioners weren't a priority for the new automated billing system, and that if he wanted the high-level tools of the trade, he needed the cold cash to back them up immediately. Thomas walked back into his humble house, his heart heavy with a quiet, simmering frustration that felt like a physical weight in his chest. He looked at Maya, sitting on the porch steps, her small feet tucked into a pair of worn-out sneakers, where the rubber was beginning to peel away from the faded canvas. He needed exactly $200 to restock his clinic and ensure Maya had what she required for the coming winter, a sum that felt like an impossible mountain in the face of his isolation.
It was a painful realization that his commitment to integrity and his refusal to take the blood money consulting fees from Alistair's company had kept them in this state of dignified poverty. Across the valley, Alistair Sterling was currently being worshipped as a god of innovation. The billionaire had spent more than $200 on a single gold-plated cap for his daughter's useless V1000 medicine, an ornamental flourish for a toxin that was failing. Thomas looked at his daughter, his jaw set with a quiet resolve, as he realized that the world often punished the man who held the truth while rewarding the man who sold the long lie.
The grand ballroom of the Sterling Plaza was a cathedral of light and digital sound as Alistair Sterling stepped onto the stage for his global keynote. Surrounded by massive, 80-foot high-definition screens displaying rotating models of synthetic molecules and glowing neural networks, he looked like a man who had finally outpaced time itself. He paced the platform in a $3,000 charcoal suit, his voice booming with a predatory confidence that demanded absolute submission from the gathered world leaders and medical experts. During his speech, he specifically mocked nature lovers and backwards thinkers who still believed that human intuition and traditional herbalism had any place in the future of the species. He called the practitioners of manual medicine relics of a failed and dirty era, laughing as he claimed that his new V1000 AI drug was the final nail in the coffin of disease. To the cheering crowd, he announced that his own daughter, Chloe, was the first patient to receive the revolutionary treatment, framing her as the living proof of his firm's absolute superiority over biology. Alistair laughed at the idea of failure, telling the audience that he had finally achieved a version of immortality that no checkbook had ever been able to buy before today.
He was so blinded by the glow of the spotlights and the roaring standing ovation that he didn't see the silent, urgent notifications beginning to flash on the diagnostic monitors in the wings of the stage. He was toasting to his corporate victory with a glass of vintage champagne, entirely unaware that the poison he had engineered was already crossing the blood-brain barrier in his own child. He believed he was a god in a white coat, but he was actually a man who had built a very expensive tomb for his own family's legacy. Silas was dancing on the edge of a total catastrophic collapse while the world bowed at his feet, oblivious to the fact that the clock was already ticking toward a biological reckoning that no amount of AI data could ever hope to manage. The long, cold night. Everything was wrong. He smiled. He was gone. He stood. He was done. The midnight stillness of the Appalachian Hills was broken only by the rhythmic, low-frequency hum of a hand-cranked lathe in Thomas's basement. While Alistair was likely sleeping in a climate-controlled penthouse, surrounded by the hollow noise of his own success, Thomas was hunched over a workbench, his calloused hands manipulating a piece of surgical-grade steel that dated back to a time before medicine was a commodity.
He was refining a manual compressor tool, a device based on a series of experimental medical journals from 1952 that had been quietly suppressed by the pharmaceutical giants because the technique couldn't be synthesized into a pill or protected by a patent. Thomas moved with a sensory intuition that transcended modern diagnostic software. His eyes narrowed behind a magnifying lens as he calibrated the spring tension of the mechanical regulator. He whispered the physics to the empty room, his mind visualizing the biological battlefield inside Chloe's body. He knew that to stop the coming collapse, he needed to trigger the baroreceptor reflex with a manual oscillating pressure of exactly 12 hertz to effectively override the cytokine storm currently raging in her nervous system. It was a technique of absolute physical precision, a method of resetting the body's own electrical rhythm without the interference of a toxic synthetic compound. He wasn't just building a tool, he was recovering a lost art of healing that the modern world had traded for the convenience of the pharmacy counter.
Maya was asleep in the room above him, clutching her toy owl. But Thomas was awake, forging the only antidote to the disaster Alistair was currently celebrating. He understood that the cure wasn't a pill or an algorithm. It was a rhythmic movement that modern medicine had deliberately forgotten a century ago in the name of profit. He polished the steel until it reflected the pale light of the basement, knowing that the time for arrogance was ending and the time for a hard, physical reality was just beginning. He was a master of the machine, and the dad who stayed in the garage to teach his daughter that a well-built life is the only machine that never breaks. He was ready for the hard and long and cold morning light. The truth was now absolute. Everything mattered. He stood. He was done. The night was still. He waited. The local town hall meeting was crowded and
The townspeople, led by a local real estate broker who was already imagining his commission, looked at Thomas from the floor with a mixture of pity and a burgeoning, aggressive impatience. They didn't ask, they demanded, telling Thomas that he was being a dangerous old man and a selfish obstacle to the town's progress and health. They called him a fraud for refusing to prescribe the new Sterling V1000 miracle drugs, accusing him of hoarding his backwards herbalism out of a bitter, ancient jealousy. They were seduced by the golden brochures and the promise of a magic pill that would erase all their suffering, completely oblivious to the fact that the very drugs they were begging for were the same slow-acting toxins that had cost Thomas his wife 5 years ago. Thomas stood at the back of the room, his calloused hands resting on the wooden railing, and said nothing as his own neighbors called him a relic of a failed era. He was the quiet outcast who refused to bow to the new money, a man who understood that a town built on a billionaire's whim was a town built on a foundation of shifting sand. He walked out into the cold night air, the voices of the neighbors echoing behind him like a storm of redirected resentment.
They wanted him gone so they could get the magic pill that was actually a slow-acting poison, never realizing that the man they were trying to drive out was the only one in the county who truly knew how to save them from themselves. The social pressure was a heavy, suffocating weight, but Thomas didn't flinch. He knew that the truth didn't require a consensus to be real. He was ready for the hard, cold night. Everything was wrong. He stood still. He was gone. The morning light. He waited. He knew. Thomas walked through the high-performance automatic sliding glass doors of Mercy General Hospital, the sharp, intrusive scent of industrial antiseptic serving as a jagged, cold reminder of the sterile world he had once mastered and ultimately abandoned for the red dirt of the foothills. He wasn't there to beg for a position or to vent his frustration. He was there because he could still hear the rhythmic ghost of that microscopic tremor in Chloe Sterling's small hand. He found the chief of staff, a man named Dr. Henderson, whose lab coat was as crisp and soulless as a fresh piece of corporate stationery, standing near the executive lounge. Thomas didn't wait for a formal introduction or a polite opening. He spoke in a voice that was low, but carried the absolute unyielding authority of a physical law, telling Henderson that he needed to review the girl's cytokine profiles immediately. He explained with clinical precision that the V1000 AI drug was triggering a dangerous, self-sustaining feedback loop in her central nervous system, a specific biological anomaly that modern diagnostic software was never programmed to detect until the neural pathways actually began to melt from the inside out. Alistair Sterling appeared from behind a soundproof glass partition, his eyes flashing with a sudden, jagged fury at the mere sight of the man from the apothecary. The billionaire didn't want a medical warning. He wanted a total, crushing victory over the man who had dared to suggest that his wealth and his technology were not infallible. Alistair let out a cold, sharp laugh that echoed through the sterile hallway, calling Thomas a delusional peasant who should go back to his dried herbs and his red dirt before he contaminated the air of a world-class facility any further. He barked that Thomas was a relic of a dying age and commanded his private security detail to have the trash banned from the hospital premises for life. As Thomas was gripped by the arms and led back toward the street, he didn't struggle or shout. He simply looked at Alistair with a calm, terrifyingly precise expression of pity, knowing that the time for words had officially passed. The warning was the last rope thrown to a drowning man. Alistair cut the rope with a sneer of pure hubris, oblivious to the fact that the clock was already ticking toward a catastrophe that no amount of money could ever stop. The evening in the VIP pediatric wing began with a deceptive, artificial calm, as the hum of the high-performance air filtration system masked the mechanical failure brewing within Chloe Sterling's fragile frame. For 6 hours, her vitals had remained eerily flat, a plateau that the lead manufacturer engineers had triumphantly cited as proof that the V1000 AI drug had successfully stabilized her condition. Alistair Sterling sat in a leather chair by the window, his eyes fixed on a digital stock ticker that showed his firm's valuation climbing with every passing minute. He believed the storm had been weathered, but biology rarely respects a quarterly earnings report. At precisely 7:42, the silence was shattered by a sharp, staccato alarm from the primary neural monitor.
The girl's heart rate didn't just climb, it spiked with a violent, rhythmic intensity that sent the expensive machines into a frantic, circular logic loop. The proprietary AI system, which Alistair had touted as the future of medicine, flickered 3 times before displaying a single, chilling notification across every 60-inch OLED panel in the room. Unknown systemic error. The algorithms were blind to the physical reality of a cytokine storm. As the seizure seized Chloe's body, the robotic ventilator began to surge, overpressurizing her lungs in a desperate, automated attempt to match her oxygen demand, actually accelerating the physical trauma. Dr. Henderson and his team of PhDs stood paralyzed at the central console, their hands hovering over touchscreen overrides that refused to respond to their frantic commands. They were trapped in a loop of high-tech incompetence, watching a tragedy unfold through the very data they had worshipped. Alistair bolted upright, his glass of scotch shattering on the polished marble, as he realized that his billions had bought him a front-row seat to his own daughter's destruction.
He began screaming at the doctors to do something, to reset the system, to summon another expert immediately. But there was no one left to call. The billion-dollar ICU had become a high-tech coffin, and no one in the city had the key to unlock the biological lock Alistair had built. He stood in the center of the crimson light, a king whose crown was now a heavy, cold, and truly useless lead weight in the dark night. Thomas sat on the porch of his cabin, the blue light of a portable television reflecting in his eyes as a frantic reporter stood outside Mercy General, describing the developing crisis inside the Sterling wing. The screen showed Alistair being led away by assistants, his face pale and broken, a man who finally understood that his money couldn't buy a single breath for his dying child. Thomas felt a cold, intoxicating pulse of vindication in his veins, a dark satisfaction that tasted like iron and smoke. He thought of Sarah, of the sterile boardroom where Alistair had signed the documents that rushed the toxic drug to market, and of the long, lonely nights he had spent holding Maya while his wife's life slipped away in a hospital bed very similar to Chloe's. A part of him wanted to turn the television off and let the billionaire feel the weight of a silence that could never be filled.
He wanted Alistair to experience the absolute crushing helplessness of being the smartest man in the room while watching the person he loved most turn into a ghost. But as the reporter continued her frantic update, a small hand tugged at the sleeve of his flannel shirt. Maya was standing there, her brow furrowed in a look of profound, quiet empathy that she had inherited from her mother. She was clutching her plush toy owl, Doc, and she held it out to him with a solemn, rhythmic nod. She looked at the flickering image of Alistair Sterling on the screen, and then back at her father, her voice soft, as she told him that the girl was just a girl, and that he should go and help her because she was hurting. Thomas looked at his daughter, the innocent anchor of his life, and realized that his medical oath was not a contract with a company, but a debt he owed to the human heart.
The man who had lost everything to Alistair was now the only one who could save Alistair from the same fate. He stood and gripped his wooden box.
Thomas Reed moved through the service corridors of Mercy General with the invisible efficiency of a man who had clearing procedures embedded in his muscle memory. He didn't use the grand marble lobby. Instead, he bypassed the 3 layers of high-tech biometric security by using a maintenance key override he had noted during his previous visit. He stepped into the high-security ICU, his heavy flannel shirt and worn work boots a jarring, oil-stained intrusion into a world of polished chrome and desperate, sterile silence. Alistair Sterling was hunched over the foot of the bed, a man of paper and ash, while Dr. Henderson and his team of PhDs stood in a frozen circle around the failing monitors. They were staring at a digital death sentence, their expensive algorithms paralyzed by a biological reality they couldn't name. Thomas didn't wait for permission or an explanation. He walked directly to the primary IV infusion.
He told them to be quiet and watch. He reached into his wooden box and produced the manual compressor tool he had forged in his basement. Thomas stood at the head of the bed, his eyes narrowed and focused, and began the 1950 manual thermal reset. He manipulated the carotid sinus with a rhythmic 2-pound pressure, his fingers moving with a sensory memory that transcended 40 years of synthetic medical evolution. He wasn't looking at a screen. He was feeling the elasticity of the artery and the heat of the girl's blood through his own fingertips. The next 5 minutes were a vacuum of absolute, suffocating silence, broken only by the low mechanical whine of a backup generator. The doctors watched in horror as a janitor-looking man in a faded shirt performed a maneuver that their multi-million-dollar computers had flagged as physically impossible. They waited for the final flatline, convinced that Thomas was merely finishing what the seizure had started. But then, the rhythmic screaming of the monitors began to slow. The erratic, jagged spikes of Chloe's heart rate began to smooth into a steady, melodic wave, dropping from 200 beats per minute down to a calm, restorative 80. The seizure subsided, her body finally going soft against the sheets as the cytokine storm broke under the pressure of a human hand. Thomas didn't move until the vitals hit absolute 0 variance. He stepped back now. The room remained silent for another 10 long seconds until Chloe's eyelashes finally flickered and her eyes opened, clear and deeply focused for the first time in many days. She looked up at Thomas, her small hand reaching out to touch his rough sleeve, as the oxygen saturation levels on the monitor turned a solid, healthy, and vibrant green. The heavy pressurized doors slid open once more, and Dr. Marcus Vance, the nation's most respected chief of surgery, hurried into the room. He stopped mid-stride, his eyes widening as they settled on Thomas Reed. He didn't look at the billionaire or the expensive machines. He looked at the man in the flannel shirt with a profound reverence that bordered on absolute awe. He whispered a name that silenced the room, asking if it was truly Dr. Thomas Reed, the man known as the Oracle of Johns Hopkins, who had vanished 5 years ago after the Sterling scandal. Alistair Sterling felt the ground beneath his polished shoes begin to dissolve as the realization hit him with the force of a physical hammer. The man he had mocked as a local witch doctor and a delusional peasant was actually the most legendary neurosurgeon of the current generation, a man whose peer-reviewed studies Alistair's own firm had used as the foundation for their early research.
Even more devastating was the digital data now scrolling across the secondary monitor, which Thomas had rerouted. It showed the unmistakable metallurgical markers of toxicity caused by the V1000 AI drug. Alistair stared at the screen, his face turning a sickly ashen color as he understood that his pursuit of a $10 billion profit had turned his own company's flagship medicine into a lethal poison for his only child. He looked from the monitor to Thomas's calloused hands, finally understanding the magnitude of his own catastrophic blindness. He had built a temple of synthetic greed, assuming that money could replace the soul of a healer, only to find that the very man he had tried to drive out of the valley was the only antidote to the disaster he had authored. Alistair's $10 billion drug was the secret poison,
and the man he had mocked was the antidote. The billionaire was left shivering in the cold blue light of the high-tech wing, realizing his entire world was a carefully curated lie that had almost cost him life. Alistair Sterling stood in the center of the high-tech ICU, his $1,000 loafers feeling heavy and cold on the pristine marble floor.
The alarms had finally stopped their frantic screaming, replaced by the low, melodic hum of a steady heart rate. But the billionaire felt as though the very air had been drained from his lungs. He looked at Thomas Reed, a man he had once mocked as a common peasant, and realized that his own life's work, the synthetic miracle drug he had touted to the world, was nothing more than a polished lie. The cold realization settled into his chest like a shard of ice. His greed had not only cost Thomas his wife 5 years ago, but it had almost turned his own daughter into a ghost in the dark. In a sudden, jagged collapse of his corporate exterior, Alistair's shoulders slumped, and he fell to his knees beside the bed. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated ruin, and his voice was a broken rasp as he began to sob, begging Thomas for a forgiveness he knew he didn't deserve. He offered Thomas millions. He offered him power. He offered him the very firm that had built his fortune, if only the healer would tell him that he wasn't a monster. Thomas didn't look at the money or the billionaire's trembling hands. He simply stood there with a quiet, unshakable integrity that money could never buy. He looked Alistair in the eye and delivered a final, devastating truth that cut through the luxury of the room.